Hello. This is called The Haunted Text. It is part one of a tale that grows with the telling, not of my own story, but of Homer's Odyssey, which is being performed in his Greek and my English elsewhere on this Substack. Look for the titles called Homer in English, or subtitled Homer in English. The Haunted Text, Music, Allusion, and Stagecraft in Homer's Odyssey. One cannot any longer ignore accentuation in ancient Greek and Latin verse under the spurious concept of quantitative meter. In particular, the perennial problem of allusion in Homer takes on new dimensions when the phenomenon of musical resonance is brought to bear, together with a focus on the audience's point of contact in performance. The rhapsode wielding a staff, a soloist without a musical instrument or dancers, who appears to be prompted by his script to a distinctive form of stagecraft. Quantitative meter is a concept which is thought to apply distinctively to ancient Greek and Latin poetry, but in fact describes the substrate of all the familiar modern forms of music, from Baroque to classical, atonal, jazz, blues, rock, hip-hop, or pop. Whole number ratios define the durations of notes in these forms, which more often than not derive their patterns from the up and down beats of dance steps, rather than from ordering into rhythm the stressed and unstressed syllables of natural language, as happens in the English pentameter. In the ancient poetry, a distinction between syllable lengths, which is partly natural, is pressed into service so as to carry these whole number ratios between long and short steps, most often, but not always, in the ratio 2:1, as between the long and two shorts of a dactylic foot. I say pressed into service, as there was no doubt something artificial about the sound of such whole number ratios when compared to the syllables of plain speech, which makes an utterance sound like singing rather than speaking. In "Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are," each syllable is pronounced unnaturally equal in duration, but the effect sounds perfectly natural for singing. Similarly, in "Mani navide te a," the opening phrase of the Iliad, the long underlined syllables are performed exactly double the duration of the short ones to achieve the dactylic effect, like a folk dance step. But there is no reason to suppose that Homer or his mates always talked in that sing-song way. In other words, in spoken Greek, rather than metrical or poetic Greek, not all long syllables would have taken the same length of time to say, nor were they all double the length of shorter syllables, while some short syllables would have been shorter than others. Hence the language of all ancient Greek poetry was stylized. It is not just the timed ratios between syllable lengths that turn speech into song, however. There are also the changes of pitch and emphases on certain quanta, which give the bare metrical pattern both melody and rhythm. Greek and Latin, both, are self-described as pitch-accented languages. Latinists and linguists generally deny this for Latin. They assert in error that classical Latin had a stress accent. Quintilian, for his part, describes certain Latin syllables as acute, grave, or flex, where the term grave does not mean unaccented, but, as its name suggests, describes the heavy downglide in pitch which immediately follows the sharp rise on the acute syllable. Flex means up and down both over the same vowel, with the falling glide in pitch predominating. So Greek and Latin do both supply inbuilt melodic contours when they are arranged by poets to accompany metrical steps or feet. Yes, we still call the basic metrical groupings, such as dactyls, trochees, and iambs, feet. This ought long since to have been a clue that once upon a time feet were dance steps, performed by the foot and the legs, and only accompanied by the voice or other sources of music. But one more phenomenon is required of the ancient poetic languages to make their accompaniment musical. This is dynamic emphasis, which either reinforces the metrical downbeat or syncopates the rhythm by reinforcing within the upbeat. Twinkle, twinkle, notwithstanding, the robotic reinforcement of the downbeat in modern notation immediately after the bar line produces fatigue rather than the sense of music. This dynamic emphasis in ancient poetry has now been discovered in the combination of pitch change with metrical quantity, in particular the tendency to place the downglide in pitch, which occurs in both grave and flex syllables, on long metrical downbeats. The latter tendency is documented for Greek by Sidney Allen. I developed a new theory of the Greek accent, which entails a law of tonal prominence, drawing on Allen's descriptive work in metrical environments, which tells you when each of the downglides in pitch, which are usually and confusingly unmarked in Greek texts, and the marked acute rises in pitch, is dynamically prominent. In other words, which one when. It is not always the visually accented syllable which is sonically accented. That's where the confusion has come in for more than 1,000 years. The positions within words and enclitic groupings predicted for dynamic prominence by the new law correspond to the consensus among historical linguists for stress positions in Greek words, involving both a rising pitch stress and a separate falling pitch stress, two different kinds of stresses. This finding among linguists goes practically unheeded by professional Hellenists, despite its implications for how to perform Greek poetry. The law turns out to apply also to Latin in a similar way, predicting dynamic prominence for the very same syllables deemed to be stressed by the conventional rule, which for Latin is stress the penultimate syllable when the penult is long, but the antepenult when the penult is short. There is a moment in the Iliad when Odysseus has finally had enough of servility to the unworthiness of Agamemnon. For the latest time, the warlord counsels escape, an ignominious pushing off of the ships by night, forever abandoning the expedition to Troy. Odysseus addresses him as Oulomen, accursed, probably best translated by a swear word, and bursts out, Siga, metist allos akaion tuton accusei, muton onuken anerge diastoma pampanagoito, hostis epistaito, heisi presim artia basdin, skepto costia, kai huoi petoiato lavoi, tossoisin sumetarge oisi vanasses. Shut up, lest any other of the Achaeans hear this disclosure, which no man would let out his mouth at all, any man who'd know in his mind's vessels to speak what suits, and be the scepter-bearer, and the one whom armies obey, so many as are the Argives among whom you're the lord. The accentuation of the first line of the speech is highly unusual. There are actually 5 long beats in a row to begin the line. 4 of the 5 are dynamically prominent or stressed, according to the new law. All of them have changing pitch, 4 rising and 1 falling. Such a sequence bluntly suspends the tripping dactylic rhythm, long, short, short, with long, 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 long. Note in particular the sequence of 3 straight, long, acutely accented syllables, 3 long syllables of sharply rising pitch, matistallos. Perhaps there is a staircase effect to a high-pitch peak. The line is musically as well as emotionally an emphatic outburst. This moment of defiance against authority, counter to Odysseus' character elsewhere, evidently made a big impression on the composer of the Odyssey and its hero Odysseus. The striking accentual pattern from beginning to mid-line recurs several times in key speeches of Odysseus, which are reported by Odysseus himself. 2 of these are in the episode with Polyphemus. First, in Odysseus' indignant expression at being taken for a fool by the brute. Huto garpu me helpet enipresi napionenai. For I suppose he expected me in his mind's vessel to be such a simpleton. Then the identical accentual sequence occurs at the beginning of the memorable and fateful speech, where he announces his true name to the Cyclops. Kuklops, aikentisse katatsnaton anthropon, optalmo eratai, awekelian ala otun, pastaioduseu aptoliportion exalaosai. Cyclops, if there's any death-bound human being should ask after the ugly blinding of your eye, announce it was Odysseus, the city-sacker, who blinded you. A visual inspection reveals that in the rest of the line and the following lines, prominent syllables, here underlined, are generally spaced between unaccented ones in the normal give and take of poetic rhythm. Hence, Odysseus' particular sequence stands out objectively and pointedly. The concentrated outburst occurs also at the dramatic moment Odysseus' identity is almost revealed when the nurse Eurycleia discovers his scar and drops his leg into the wash basin. By this point, however, his identity is already revealed in his accents. He says to her, Siga matistallos enimega reisi putatai. Silence, lest anyone else in the big room's here. By anyone else, Odysseus means Penelope, who is the only other person within earshot. In the latter case, the whole half line from the Iliad, as well as the distinctive accentual pattern, are resounded. Most instructively, perhaps, this pattern appears when Odysseus is earlier disguised as an old beggar in the swineherd's hut and tells a lying story about how he once bivouacked with Odysseus. In winter, he quotes Odysseus as uttering almost exactly the same hushed outburst he had used against Agamemnon in the Iliad. Siga nud matisse akaion allos accusei. Hush now, in case some other Achaean hears you. Odysseus, in disguise, wants to be convincing that his assumed character has met the real Odysseus among people who know the real Odysseus. The pitch patterns by themselves, even when the words bearing them are different, are identifying. Hence, Homer's craft is shown to be at work in creating a distinct musical identity for Odysseus, in conversation with perhaps his most redeeming moment in the Iliad. I wrote, What is marvelous here is that this is Odysseus trying to sound like Odysseus. May we not surmise that this character was coming to be known for the emphatic, long-syllabled, oxytonal crescendo at the beginning of his hexameters, and his stage whisper, known for his hoarsely whispered "shut up," known in the strictly metatextual sense for that very line from Iliad 14. It is a bit like Don Quixote appearing in his sequel, where he is already a literary sensation, a character whose words and actions people have read about in the first book. In the previous line, Odysseus playing the Cretan even advises that Odysseus speaks the line in a, quote, little voice, "Phtenxaminos dolige opime," cueing the performer's stage whisper for the outburst. We have been set up by Homer long in advance, through Odysseus himself in his lying tale, for the scene of the recognition by the scar in Book 19, when Nurse Eurycleia famously drops his leg in the wash basin. Odysseus' tonal outburst gives himself away as surely as his scar. Homer's text appears to contain intentional music, separable from the meaning or intent of its words. Philology is therefore no longer adequate to interpret such a text unless it loses its habit of disregarding accentual prosody. Penelope in the Odyssey has an even more striking leitmotif, which recurs uniquely often in her speech, with its culminating instance in the recognition scene of Book 23, when she performs the bed trick upon Odysseus. O telian agamai, maladau void hoioseasta. Nor am I even so amazed, but damn it, I know you, what you were. I wrote, there is in this period a remarkable sequence against all notions of epic rhythm and harmony, of three successive circumflected syllables, O void hoioseasta. If there is an absolute in metrical theory, it is that rhythm depends on alternation, on the alternation of emphases in time. Hence there is also something absolute about the harmonic innovation registered here. Three consecutive complete Hellenic contonations should be unsingable within a dactylic line. Even someone who hears formulae in Homer must admit that there is something more than an instance of non-formulaic language going on here. There is something antithetical to the very notion of a metrical formula. Indeed, it is by innovation that the concept tradition is analytically determined, and hence by which it comes properly to light, not by the formula. At a moment of ultimate tension, the histrionic minstrel has dared his music to overreach its native forms, to find and to embody an expression inside the rhythm and harmony of the epic line, which captures the sure mind, the knowing heart, the very living breath of Penelope. I know you, what you were, she seems to say to the stranger before her, with all the force and risk of her own identity. This is a moment to be savoured, a moment of musical disclosure and self-revelation, a moment scarcely to be matched in the apparitions of later literature. All of the presumptions and implicit premises which drive the idea that Homer's text is a product of an oral tradition, all of its noble savage mentality, together with many of the conclusions and constructs which follow, must be put to one side until the idea can be grounded in the intentional musical reality of Homer's extant text. Sequences of pitch changes only become melodies when they recur, as it were, verbatim. One generally has to repeat a set of tones in a certain rhythm before they can register as a melody, rather than a random sequence. The recurrence and repetition, which are the stock in trade of oral theory, lose all need for explanation in a musical text. Philological prompts toward diction and theme may move mountains in analyzing the Gospel of St. Matthew, but they yield to other motive forces when it comes to Johann Sebastian Bach's St. Matthew Passion. Theme, in particular, must take on its musical color, which brings an intrinsic desideratum rather than an editor's scrutiny to the concept of variation, whose display in modern music, from classical to jazz, is sophisticated enough to illuminate the text of Homer. The modus of theme and variation, or variations on a theme, should be seen to motivate composition rather than reflect exigencies of either oral transmission or performance. In point of fact, metrical formulas are inadequate as building materials for any musical text, from Homer to Bach to the Sex Pistols. All of them are not only quantitative, but rhythmic and harmonic. The leitmotifs of Odysseus and Penelope, respectively 3 straight rising long acutes and 3 straight long circumflexes, are pointed insults to the sense of dactylic rhythm. Word-level accents are usually separated from each other by the unaccented syllables. It takes compositional engineering by means of enclitics and elisions to achieve the sequences which characterize Penelope and Odysseus at moments of heightened drama, moments which elicit an outburst from their carefully considered facades into the breath of living music. I know you, what you were. Preserved in Homer's composition, not only in the accented written versions left by Alexandrian scholars, but in Homer's own living words, are the distinctive cadences of Penelope's and Odysseus's voices at moments of indignance and passion. It may excite ambitious students of Greek that Homer's music is largely an unknown, but that there are now new tools, such as the law of tonal prominence, with which to recreate and explore his score, perhaps to discover new depths of resonance and allusion. There is no longer a need to limit yourself to the imagined epic cycle of the, quote, neo-analysts, when you sound out Homer's score for its internal echoes and musical evocations. To be sure, external allusions in Homer remain a labyrinthine critical problem. But it should be clear that the number of people presently familiar enough with Homer's music and how it works to be able to compare it to something or anything else must be vanishingly small. For now. But it seems to me the ability to restore the music to Homer's text through attention to melodic contours and applying the law of tonal prominence makes most of this poet's extant material newly virgin territory. The leitmotifs mentioned above should be considered blunt instruments, for all that philology so far has let them go unnoticed, compared to the subtleties of theme and variation we should expect in a musical narrative. In what follows, I cannot pretend to have heard all that there is to hear in the passages I shall discuss, but I hope I shall advance the possibility that Homer's Greek and the art of Homer's line will become interests of renewed intensity for prospective and prospecting students. There will no longer be a need to couch one's observations in the language of oral theory and to use the word tradition in every second paragraph. The only direct internal indication of traditional inheritance in Homer comes through the catalogue form. These include biblical style genealogies as well as lists of events. The Iliad's catalogue of ships may well be a quotation of sorts. I have suggested that some peculiarities of narrative form in Homer and Hesiod, especially ring composition, can be traced to expansions via digression and retrogression within the listed segments of a catalogue. An original motivation for an extemporizer of closing each digression with a retrogression, turning the inserted story into an oral ring, would have been to keep his place in the sequence, like someone interrupted from counting pennies, trying to remember what number he had been on before he went on his excursion. In Homer and Hesiod, one should assume that the mnemonic technique had instead become an aesthetic style. A catalogue we encounter in Homer's composition need not be a traditional one, as we shall see, but a composer tapping into a familiar style, like Mozart writing a march in Figaro. Crucially, nothing about Homer's noun and epithet-laden language points to inherited use of any kind, only to the natural reflex in music to create context in the only way it knows how, through repetition, and to the instantiation in performance of singing an object or person with its full name, that is, not bare, but replete with its evocative epithets. Modern editors sometimes curtail him, but Odysseus never misses an opportunity in his long tale to the Phaeacians to have someone address him with his full epos or summoning line, so that through the superior to whom he is giving voice, whether a Circe or a Tiresias, he in effect keeps invoking and instantiating himself. Diogenes laertiada polumer canodusou. Zeus-born, son of Laertes, contriver Odysseus. Why should we not also see Homer as a self-promoter? There is every reason to suppose that he was an innovator and an iconoclast. To judge by his reception among later authors, from Stesichorus to Sappho to Plato, he was at best a competitor or foil, at worst a corrupter of morals who needed to be refuted or purged. In relation to Greek religion and ritual, the explicit evidence is that Homer was, if anything, a source of tradition and of practices, like the text of the Gospels, and not at all the product of a tradition of which anyone was in any way aware. The ancients knew their poetry by the proper names of its composers, in exactly the way that we know our music. And in our own case, the names of Bach and Wagner and the Rolling Stones speak to the inimitable quality of their musical signature. Only proper names can identify this quality in relation to generic styles and meters. The same must have been true for ancient poets. Hesiod does not swing like Homer. This is why the Homeric question has always been a red herring. Ancient Greeks and perhaps non-Greeks like the Romans needed to know nothing about Homer's biography, as we need know nothing about Bach's, to recognize instantly the unique and identifying qualities of his music, so that we must call it by his name. The more we become familiar with it, the more one should expect that we will recognize what the ancients did implicitly and explicitly, that Homer's word music, by itself, like Bach's and Shakespeare's, forges an identity. And every word doth almost say his name. While all of Homer can be danced in the round, or sung to the accompaniment of a lyre without the dactylic beat of the dancers, we know that large Athenian audiences met Homer's music in the lyreless declamation of a rhapsode, wrapped in a cloak and holding or wielding a staff. Let us meet him there on his stage. I see him as a haunted figure, equally haunted by the invisible dance which animates the rhythm of his words, as by the long-dead people who continually possess him, and speaks through him like a medium. His is still a text made of words, each of which needs to be passed before a thought or a story can emerge. But the story comes to us in rhythmic segments and melodic lines, which are separable from its phrases and sentences, while engaged with them in a constant dovetailing at cadences both musical and narrative. This performer of the tale regularly makes his presence intrude when he announces that he is changing places, amebominos, from one speaker to another. This middle-voiced insertion of the narrator is always translated as applied to the new speaker, who, quote, replies, as though he or she is in a novel. I suggest that it is in fact a rhapsode telling you that he is changing parts. His is a one-man show. The propulsion of music and stagecraft must now combine with language to deliver the epic moment in solo theatre, and so inform its critical reception. Odyssey 5 opens with Eos the Dawn getting out of bed. The famous line which invokes the dawn with her fingertips of rose now gets instead a two-line vignette, which sounds themes that redound as the episode develops. Was deklekeon paragao Tithonus ornutinatana toisi pos peroia de brotoisin. Eos the Dawn from her bed alongside handsome Tithonus arose to bring light to deathless ones as well as mortals. Homer describes what is in the literal sense an everyday event. The dawn happens every day, and it is described in everyday terms, a woman waking up next her partner, who's perhaps still sleeping. Everything is settled and routine, a wife getting up before her husband to greet the dawn. As this routine so aptly evokes the sunrise humanly, it becomes not so odd that the woman in question is the sunrise. She opens a window and shines upon the world, not just on everyday folks, but on immortals as well, who evidently do not see so well by their own radiance. The two lines are sung, and they're done. We move straight on to the redux of Athena's plea to Zeus in the gods' council, in preparation for our first meeting with Odysseus on Calypso's isle. It would be typical of professional Homerism to say that the Waking Dawn's lines have, quote, accomplished their purpose in supplying the, quote, oral poet two lines of the traditional flowery stuff, to say what a modern novelist gets done more efficiently, economically, and rationally with "When the sun rose." It has been observed, famously by Erich Auerbach, that Homer's narrative designs no depths. It is all the manipulation, often dazzling, of surface and foreground. But those who make and promote this observation have perhaps not understood it properly. A surface and a foreground have, after all, only an analytic reality in relation to a background and a depth. To say that Homer is all surface is really equivalent to saying that he is all depth, unless one says that Homer is himself somehow unaware of the distinction. To a human mind, a text or other artwork that designedly presents a foreground must represent a more or less irresistible invitation to enter and to penetrate. Like the surface of Achilles' shield, Homer's text is engrossing and captivating on the literate level, a mirror of polished metal held up to the cosmos. But like the shield, it cannot point to itself. It is for the reader to recognize that the mirror is in fact a shield, and so to ask with reference to the world pictured there, who or what is it protecting, and from what or whom? This idea of the Homeric foreground complexifies when one considers the situation of a rhapsode's performance. This fellow's prospect is pretty obvious in the daylight of a Greek theatre. He's just a guy in a cloak or a robe holding a stick. There is no hiding the fact that between himself and his audience and their imagination is a foreground that he takes great care to construct, and for which his author scripts in broad detail of embedded instruction. Recall that the rhapsode's art did not become obsolete when it had to compete with dramatists who had scenery, machinery, masks, props, and costumes to aid their immersive illusion. His was a one-man show without any soundtrack but what his voice and words could generate. Hence the presentation of a foreground with the limited means at its disposal and how it might stimulate the imaginative interpretation of the people watching him is very much front and center in the pragmatic consciousness of both composer and performer, rather than some sort of primitive necessity of legendary narrative, as Auerbach's perhaps would seem to hint. In Homer's script there is generally an intuitive use for the performer's magic staff, for the drape of his clothing, and also for the posture of his spine beneath. There is nothing easy about doing his craft well and effectively. He is to become girls, goddesses, and monsters, talking ghosts and old men and Zeus himself. The dramatic magic of his becoming these people and speaking in their voices like a medium in a seance can be even more effective in the solo performer's sudden transformation than in the actor taking the stage already masked and in persona. But the true miracle in the representation occurs in and through the choice arrangement of the poet's language. It is purely the power of words which can just as soon place us before Calypso's garden as Hades' abyss. But in the case of Homer's words, it is more than their semantic potency which captivates a captive audience. The proper translation of poietas and poiema from Greek is never poet and poem, given the literary connotations that have accrued to these terms. We tend to distinguish poetry from music. This distinction makes no sense in the world of ancient Greek, whose syllables, as we have observed, lend themselves to quantitative arrangement like the syllables and notes of most all familiar songs and melodies, and are inherently pitch-accented, which is to say, rhythmic and melodic. The words do not have to be set to music, but rather arranged so as to produce the music which best makes the composer's or choreographer's point. In contexts of ancient performance and entertainment, the poet in Greek is therefore a composer and his work a composition. In lyric pieces, he is also a choreographer, and his composition a dance, a choros. Every Homeric hexameter line, or epos, is suffused subliminally with its mesmerizing percussive dance rhythm, punctuated with invocative naming phrases for people and objects, and graced with signature lines of prosodic melody to awaken the musical consciousness and the musical memory. It is the discovery of these rather obvious leitmotifs, identifying each of Penelope and Odysseus, which puts paid once and for all to an oral theory of Homeric composition based on solely metrical formulas. Such a theory tries to account for a musical composition purely by its time signature, while ignoring all the notes. In particular, Homer's musical phrases, which must be repeated to become fully musical, are horrifically and also ludicrously denuded when treated as metrical building blocks. Music cannot be made by meter alone. Meter gives us only the bar lines, the repeating downbeats. As I say, we need pitch patterns and accentual emphases, which do not always have to fall on the downbeat at the bar line to fill the frame with music. In ancient Greek, these pitches and syncopating emphases are supplied by the words themselves. They fill the empty staff with notes. Some might now find themselves diverted by a theory of musical formulas in Homer, but even these can never account for prosodic patterns evidently composed as signature lines, which are not tied exclusively to the particular words which carry them. It is both false and demeaning to think of Homer as motivated to fill up his line with prepackaged goods, the purported metrical formulas, when he has evidently composed a lilting, pointed, and resonant recitative. Homer's phrases recur and re-echo because music is music, and so is musicae. Hence the mimetic work of creating a convincing foreground in a minimalist theatre is immediately deepened and layered by the largely non-mimetic musical dimensions embedded in the verbal voicing of the story. Of course, these dimensions are lost on critics trained in literature, like Auerbach, and still more on scholars trained in grammar, like the professors in classical languages. They provide an immediate ground for significant resonance and significant internal and external allusion in Homeric composition, no matter the literary or non-literary means of his composing, or the near total loss of neighboring compositions from Homer's musical world, which he may either have been hinting at, borrowing, or directly quoting, like Coltrane riffing on My Favorite Things from The Sound of Music. Music abhors a vacuum. It transmits itself like a hum. I have given concrete evidence that one line from the Iliad, emoted by Odysseus, which likely does not make most top 10 lists, made a rather huge impression on the composer of the Odyssey. Resonance seems to be the key to so many facts of lived experience, from physics to music to emotion and sympathy. Something internal to the individual or the atom reverberates in response to external stimuli, to result in sympathetic resonance or even the emission of energy. Memory itself, including musical memory, seems to work this way when the oddest external twitterings can produce responsive reverberations and generate internal images like waking dreams. One species of resonance is the phenomenon we call allusion. We don't always know what it is in a work of art which makes us think of something else, including other works of art. But resonance is ubiquitous and is not usefully distinguishable from feeling or memory. When words or brushstrokes are involved, the puzzle can become forensic. In academic circles, there are those who think that allusions need to be proven. But before addressing the problem of allusion in Homer, I think it's important to recognize the breadth of the field of phenomena in which such bookish pursuits actually lie. The Homeric medium is intrinsically musical, and hence intrinsically reverberative and allusive. The philologists who preside over the poems, however, are not required to be musical at all. Grammar, rather, and linguistics generally have their own quasi-logical and inductive attractions whose needs are sated by solutions in static, tabulated paradigms. We murder to dissect. The art which is taught consists of applying the paradigms and classifications induced from the extant nouns and verbs in writing back onto the texts themselves as aids to decoding their semantic sum. It does not strike its practitioners as absurd that there be a purely metrical music or poetry without stresses or pitches, yet made from human language which cannot function without such marking emphases. In point of fact, the absurdity here is intrinsic and self-evident. The embarrassment to philology seems due entirely to the lack of attention to pronunciation and performance in the study of ancient texts, which were almost exclusively designed as notations for performance. But even if we can now, to some small extent, restore the music to the texts with the law of tonal prominence, all we can hear or otherwise discern are internal reverberations, such as Odysseus' accentual leitmotif and its origin in the Iliad. Let's not diminish that discovery, but there are clear allusions in Homer to people and events beyond and outside the poems, which seem intentional and yet enigmatic. We must have recourse to sources we know to be later than Homer in order to get any illumination upon these people and events mentioned in Homer. And we do not know if Homer agrees with these sources' implicit schemas, or if indeed they were formulated on occasion as direct refutations of Homer or his implications. And in some cases, though we cannot responsibly take them, these allusions remain achingly critical to our reasonable understanding of Homer's composition. Consider Tithonus. Yes, him, the one we left behind in Eos's bed. His name sits at the cadence of line 1, invoked with an epithet of general commendation or status, agawos, unknown in its precise meaning, which I have rendered, perhaps provocatively, handsome. The only other musical moment of note is the enjambment of the verb ornut into line 2. She rose, its displacement helping to bring the dawn rhythmically to life. So what do we know of Tithonus from the forbidden later sources? And what of these resonates when Homer drops his name? One thing we know for sure is that Homer counts on his audience knowing who this is. He could not simply drop Tithonus' name for no reason. He is not introduced with a backstory. In this, he is like Athena or Circe. They appear on Homer's stage as known beings. An exception among the divinities may be Calypso. Athena in Book 1 does tell us whose daughter she is and where she lives. That may be an example of what we would call necessary exposition for an unfamiliar character, or one Homer has invented. Perhaps then we can go further and assert that Homer is purposely being elliptical, without any stipulation as to what exactly he might be leaving out. Only that he is knowingly sounding the name and epithet agawos Tithonus without saying all or anything he knows. In other words, he is after the effect of dropping his name into the mix precisely for the effect of its reverberant entrance into consciousness, whatever that effect may be. We are also on safe ground, one feels, in adding that Tithonus is a mortal. All the stories assume this, and the idea of a goddess having sex with a mortal male and all its attendant perils seems to be thematic for the introduction of Odysseus' situation on Calypso's isle of Ogygia. Calypso later rallies with her indignant response to Zeus's order, which had been delivered by Hermes, that she must give up Odysseus and help him make his return home. She complains about the god's jealousy of women with tastes like hers. I think she means the Olympian gods. Sketlioi esteteoi, zdallamones exokon allon, hoitete aisagaste, parandras in eunas destai, ampadian, antiste pilon poies et acoitan. Bastard you are, you gods, jealous on top of the rest of your rubbish. So to begrudge the goddesses who sleep with human men, out in the open, if one of us makes him our special bunkmate. Calypso gives two examples of their vindictive moralizing. The first again involves Eos the Dawn, who evidently has a thing for human men. Eos, Latin aurora, is known for a number of abductions. She seized Heleto, that is, raped Orion, and seemingly continued to enjoy him until Artemis struck the hunter down with her gentle arrows. Things do not end well for the men in these situations. Such a lesson is not lost on our audience, but it is not clear how much these stories play a part in Odysseus' thinking when he later rejects Calypso for Penelope. He is not present for this private exchange between gods, but is away off on a lonely headland. The second example is Demeter herself, who is known through no less an authority than the Homeric hymn to Demeter to be the mother of Persephone. This lineage does not signify in Calypso's story, however, or indeed elsewhere in the Iliad or the Odyssey, either with respect to Persephone or Demeter. Here Demeter is a pretty braids, Euplokamos, who falls in love with the mortal lad Iasion. Hos topot Iasioni Euplokamos Demeter, hoi tu moi vixasa, miga pilotati caionei, neoieni tripolloi. And as when, with Iasion, pretty braids Demeter, yielding to her very life's breath, had consensual sex and love-making in the thrice-ploughed fallow. The sense of pilotas, amity, suggests the consensual yielding to passion for this couple, which contrasts with the Dawn's taking of Orion. Iasion is killed by Zeus's thunderbolt for his time with Demeter in the thrice-ploughed fallow. Perhaps it was 3 times on that occasion. Calypso goes on. Hos nun moi agaste teoi proton andra parenai, con menegones aosa peritropios bebaota, oion epehoi neuatoan argati keraunoi, sdeus elasase keasse, mesoi eni voino pipontoi. And now my turn for your grudge, ye gods, for living with a human man. This is one I personally rescued, bestriding a ship's keel all alone, since his swift ship with the flashing thunderbolt Zeus convulsed and split in 2 in the middle of the drunken deep. How wonderful is her turn of phrase, bestriding a ship's keel, peritropios bebaota, in describing her encounter with her version of the man of many turns, Polutropos, whom she rescued from being all alone on the sea, an icon of our condition, on the turner, peritropios, of a now wrecked ship. She appears to have drawn a lesson from the awkward and inconvenient mortality of the men in her lover's tales, to declare that she would make Odysseus deathless and ageless, quote, all his days. It's not clear how she might do this, however, and prevent his dying at another god's hands. Perhaps all she need do is feed him the ambrosia and nectar she reserves for her guest Hermes, who must listen to her indignant harangue. But she has not yet done this. Her promise remains a dangled enticement for her lover to remain with her, without fear of the fate of his mortal predecessors, who had the misfortune of being chosen to please a goddess. It would seem that permission would be required for such a move from powers greater than she, the same powers who have secluded her on a deserted isle. It is hard to imagine that Athena could consent to losing her special one, Odysseus. Calypso is perhaps a lover who will swear to anything at certain moments. Deathless and ageless hints at something that may slip the attention, however. If the external stories may be relied upon, it would seem that Eos the Dawn had learnt a lesson of her experience with Orion and asked, when her radiant gaze fell upon young Tithonus, that he be made immortal. Zeus granted her wish. But the story goes, the poor thing did not think to ask that he also not age. Tithonus became a proper Struldbrug. The Struldbrugs were Jonathan Swift's immortals, who kept getting older and older, and correspondingly more repulsive and ill-tempered. When his grey hairs and beard started sprouting, of course he had to shun Tithonus' bed. The very idea. But Eos was kind enough to have him fed and clothed in her house. But at last, al hotide pampan stugeron katagera sepeget, udetiki nesai meleon tunat udanaerai, hede dehoi katatu monariste painetobola, entalamoi katetake turaste petake painas, tudatoi ponere aspetos udetikicus estoie paros esken enignam toisi melessin. When repulsive old age pressed fully upon him, and he could not move or lift any of his limbs, this is what she decided was the best course. She laid him away in a chamber and shut its shining doors. His voice still runs on unceasing, but there is none of the strength that there used to be in his bent limbs. This is from the Hymn to Aphrodite, translated by West. In effect, Tithonus would have been a prisoner in his own bedroom, which was perhaps soundproofed, if he could have got out of bed or even moved at all. The hymn is perhaps accommodating the story. It does not tell that poor Tithonus was eventually turned into a cicada, who could chatter and chitter forever, but longed for the release of death. Now, Homer's lines are unequivocal that Eos still shared a bed with Tithonus. So who can tell what parts of the other stories, which to be fair must be described as later in extant written source, but not necessarily later in origin, are called to mind by Homer's passing evocation. But it feels safe to say that the opening lines of Book 5 are sounding a note of caution and warning about the dangers of man and goddess commingling, which later comes to a head in Calypso's impassioned oration. What moves her, of course, is not the peril to mortal men, who are constituted to wish to preserve their lives, but the unfair constraints on women's desires and choices. But it must be said, Homer's touch in this allusion is light, almost unbearably light. It is not simply the case, you see, that we are missing out because we no longer have access to the world of reference and echoes that Homer's compositions enjoyed. It seems to me that there is a designed feature here, not a bug in our reception of it. The origin of this poetry is in singing catalogues, in the presence of a continuing round dance. The object there is not only the naming of people and events from the past, but the actual summoning of them into the circle. The dancers feel the presence of the past. Their ancestors join them in the circle as the rhythmic chant of their names harmonizes with the steps of the feet. Perhaps if one dances the hymn to Aphrodite, as Walter Burkett put it, the experience of the dance merges with the experience of the deity. It seems to me that the lyreless solo rhapsode, without dancers beating the ground around him, has not lost this intrinsic summoning quality of the medium. Indeed, his role is as a medium, not just a teller. Behold the people and events and the images he draws conjured in the space around him. Orion no longer a constellation, but a hunter hunted by Artemis. Demeter in the furrow in sexual ecstasy, until suddenly everything collapses into his body and his face as he utters and becomes the voice of Calypso. When he drops Tithonus' name, and only his name, all the stories you know about him are summoned at once, but not dwelt on. This is the unbearable lightness of touch. We do not pin down morals and meanings, but let all the implications reverberate and hang there like ghosts in the air. This is an effect that, it seems to me, Homer is striving after and exploiting in his conjuring art, so that we get what might be called a haunted text. From the aesthetic standpoint, the allusion to Tithonus is not incomplete, but perfect. It is exactly as sardonic as it needs to be. When Homer enjambs Ornut, she rose, it already seems clear that Tithonus is not also rising, but staying in bed at such an early hour. But is it because he cannot rise, can no longer move at all, in his inexorably advancing decrepitude? Does not the enjambment of She Rose rather darkly and wonderfully point this up? In choosing Penelope, it seems Odysseus is choosing not only death, but aging. There's more to come. Thank you.